Good morning. Welcome to KEI. My name is Abraham Kim. I'm the Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute. We are very pleased by the overwhelming response to this jointly hosted event with CSIS and the Korea Society as we look ahead to a very momentous week of events during President Lee Myung-bak's 5-day state visit. This will be the first state visit by a South Korean president since President Kim Dae-jung more than a decade ago. On Wednesday, we'll look forward to the final congressional ratification of the KORUS FTA. Do I hear a cheer? Yay! Then on Thursday, we look forward to President Lee's summit meeting with President Obama, President Lee's speech before a joint session of Congress, and of course, the evening state dinner. We believe this is very much a celebration between two strong friends and a strengthening and an upgrade of a global partnership. We are honored here today to have three senior experts to give their perspective on this week's events. They need really no introduction, but I will go over it briefly. Dr. Victor Cha, a senior advisor and the Korea chair at CSIS and a professor at Georgetown University. Ambassador Thomas Hubbard is the chairman of the Korea Society and senior director at McLarty Associates. And of course, Ambassador Jack Pritchard is the president of KEI. We want to thank all of you again for taking the time out this afternoon to join us. Now I turn it over to Jack and invite our guests to take the stage. Thank you.
All right, well, let me add my word of welcome. And one of the things that we've done over the years is to listen to the audience. And so what you have today, particularly for those in the back, is a larger riser with higher chairs. And we took a measurement of Victor, Tom, and I to make sure we weren't over 6 feet tall and scraping the ceiling. But the intent is to make sure that everybody here got an opportunity to see and hear as clearly as possible. This is an idea that Victor had, and we were just thrilled that when he came up with the idea that all the spaces in CSIS were occupied, and so we'd have to do it here. And as Abraham said, that we're extremely pleased that the Korea Society is represented by its chairman, Tom Hubbard. You know, I'll throw in my couple cents worth, but the danger of this particular type of state visit is we all may sound alike, and the last person going is going to have fewer and fewer things to say. But I feel an obligation as the physical host of this to actually go last. So I'm going to invite Tom Hubbard as our senior member, former ambassador to Korea, to open this up and then turn it over to Victor, and I'll have some comments myself.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you, Victor and Jack, for this idea and for inviting me here to participate in my capacity as chairman of the Korea Society. I think most of you identify the Korea Society with New York. That's where our headquarters is. But in fact, we are in the process of sort of taking the Korea Society national by putting on programs in various cities around the country and by taking advantage of the fact that I live in Washington to put the Korea Society banner on the wall occasionally down here in collaboration and support of our Washington-based colleagues. I'm really very pleased to be here. I'm somewhat nervous about this event, partly because I see so many experts in the audience, and partly, Jack, because I've always been afraid of heights. And I do feel a little uneasy sitting up here, so if you hear a tremor in my voice, that is the cause. Now, this is really a wonderful occasion to be able to speak to you all, such a good audience, on the occasion of President Lee Myung-bak's long-awaited state visit to Washington. And I can't think of a state visit that is better deserved than that of Lee Myung-bak, a Korean president who I think has stood out in a world that has too few leaders. He has, I think, carved a new role for his country in the world. He has been one of those leaders, I think, who has coped best with economic and financial crisis, continuing the stellar economic performance that Korea has registered through the years. And he's also made his country I think, leader in global affairs more than any previous Korean president has done, chairing the G20, volunteering to host the nuclear security summit next year, and becoming a very, very large player in the world. This is a time when I think the U.S. relationship with Korea is the best that it has ever been. I think I wish I could say that the close relationship between the United States and South Korea is based on success in dealing with North Korea. But in some ways, I think the behavior that we've seen from North Korea in recent years, the tremendous challenges that we have seen in nuclear tests, missile tests, and actual attack on South Korean territory has had the effect of bringing us closer together on North Korea. And from the U.S. perspective, I think it has put South Korea back where it ought to be in the process of dealing with North Korea. That is right in the middle. And I think the North Korea may not be the highlight of this visit, but certainly the visit is going to serve well to continue this close process of consultation that we have carried out in the last several years. But I think the real highlight of this visit, of course, is the free trade agreement. It does seem clear that the free trade agreement will be approved by both houses of our Congress tomorrow. I can't believe I'm saying that after working for this for now 4.5 years, but I do believe we're going to get there. And it is, I think, something that will bring the U.S. Korea relationship to a new level, will add a very important new dimension to our alliance and the close relationship that we have. And so I think it will be a very good basis for carrying forward and to the future. I also think the KORUS FTA, when it is approved in the U.S. and approved in Korea, which still has to come, will be a very strong signal also of broader U.S. Commitment to Asia, a signal that we are going to build freer trade relationships in the region. We're going to remain a presence in the region, and I think this is something that the entire region is looking for. So I think this visit will symbolize an important historical relationship and an important relationship for the future. Korea, I think, during the Obama administration has been indeed a good friend at a time when we need it, at a time when all of us see greater challenges from China, at a time when Japan has in some ways been adrift. I think the solidity of this relationship with South Korea has been an anchor for our presence in the region and will continue to be so. Jack?
Great, Tom, thanks very much. Victor, this was your brainchild, so you're up next. Thanks.
Well, first I want to thank you, Ambassador Pritchard and Ambassador Hubbard, for agreeing to do this. I think it's a very nice way for the three of us to collaborate, and I think we can see by the turnout that it was something that the audience also appreciated. So thank you again for agreeing to co-host this. Let me add to what Ambassador Hubbard said. I think the first thing is that he's really got a full week when he gets here. I mean, he is on his way, if not already wheels down at Andrews or very soon. And today will be a fairly quiet day, meeting with the Korean American community and things. But from tomorrow, the events really start. Probably the main event for the day is the Chamber of Commerce lunch, and then followed in the evening by what most people believe will be a very small private occasion for President Obama and President Lee to dine together, which will be a nice additional accent to the overall week's events. Thursday is obviously the White House day with meetings in the Oval Office, and then the wider cabinet meeting, followed by lunch hosted by the Secretary of State and the Vice President. Then the joint session of Congress, presuming all goes according to plan. And you just never know with the FTA because of its tortured history, but I think all of us are relatively confident at this moment. Then the state dinner on Thursday evening, and then Friday he heads to the Midwest, and in particular to a plant in Detroit for both President Obama and President Lee to talk about the advantages of the free trade agreement. As many of you know, the state visit is about the highest honor that the United States can give to a foreign visitor. And so you have to ask why. You know, why is the U.S. doing this at this point? And I think there are basically four reasons. I mean, the first is, as all of you in this room are well aware, there clearly is a personal chemistry between these two leaders, President Obama and President Lee, frankly, that our president doesn't share with a lot of other foreign leaders. This, I think, goes back to President Obama's first trip to Asia in November of 2009, where I think everybody who was on that trip openly acknowledged the best stop of that whole trip was Korea. President Lee's mannerisms, his behavior, are not typical of your sort of straight-laced, talking points only Asian politician. He's, was a international businessman, head of Hyundai Global Construction, so he's been around the world and sees the world in a much more global way that fits very much with the way President Obama thinks. Secondly, I think not only in terms of chemistry, but as Ambassador Hubbard mentioned, I mean, Lee delivered in terms of his agenda to make Korea more of a global player, which also happened to dovetail with a lot of things that the United States wanted to do, whether it was in the climate change agenda in Copenhagen, the war in Afghanistan, anti-piracy issues, the G20, the nuclear summit. I mean, Korea really sort of emerged as a very important player on a global stage that mattered a lot for the United States. And I think that also, it's not just chemistry, but it's also that sort of cooperation that mattered too. And then third, of course, was North Korea. I mean, when an adversary does things, allies come together. And North Korea did a number of things in the past 2 years that brought Obama and Lee closer together. When, as these gentlemen know better than I, when the leaders of the two countries talk on the phone outside of G20 summits or APEC or even bilateral meetings, usually they're talking because there are bad things happening, not because there are good things happening. And in that sense, North Korea's provocations really gave Obama and Lee a chance to get to know each other a lot better through lots of phone calls and lots of FaceTime. So we have the North Koreans in part to thank for this very close relationship. And then finally, something else I think that also mattered to cement this relationship was the external environment, in the sense that the Obama administration really got thrown a couple of curveballs in Asia. Japan, the domestic political change in Japan, and then the triple disaster in China, really unfulfilled expectations in the first year of Obama-China relations. So in many ways, the environment was shifting for them, in which China became less of the cooperative player that Washington wanted, and Japan for a variety of reasons, became very insular in its outlook. And out of all this emerged Korea. Right? Korea sort of emerged as a very important player for the United States. So I think for all this, it's always a confluence of things, and this confluence of things really helped to cement this relationship and has led, and I would agree that this is about the highest point that one can imagine in U.S. ROK relations right now. And this state visit clearly is meant to put the stamp on this very important moment in U.S. ROK relations.
Okay, Victor, thanks. Well, let me add a few things, and some a repetition, but I think it's worth repeating a bit. You know, as Abe introduced the program, he talked first and foremost about a celebration, and I think that's what this is, absolutely. You know, we did not know the final day the vote would be taken for the FTA, so this was not orchestrated as a victory lap for President Lee. It's going to turn out that way, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But one of the things that I want to pick up on, both what Tom and Victor talked about, is the personal relationship between President Lee and President Obama. I'm a firm believer in symmetry driving policy. It doesn't always, but in the case where you have two presidents, as in this case, who genuinely like each other, what you end up with is a synergistic effect of our two policies where our interests converge. You saw it, as Victor explained, in President Lee stepping up at points in time when the Obama administration really needed a visible, prominent ally. He did this throughout the economic crisis that led to President Obama asking or essentially seeing that Seoul was the host for the G20 summit. Several other things in which it was President Lee who stood up and caused these things that were important to the president and our policies in general to play out. You know, this doesn't in any way diminish the high quality of the working relationship. You know, even if you were to accept on face value that in recent years, go back 4 or 5 years or so, that the U.S. Korea relationship was not as good as it could have been based upon the relationship between the leaders. If you scratched the surface and took a look at how well the State Department, the White House, the Blue House, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, all across the board, there wasn't very much difference, if at all, between those working folks. That usually doesn't change. On a relationship like the U.S. Korea relationship and other major actors, that's going to be the case year in and year out. But what makes it different and what makes all of us essentially say this is the best that we've ever seen the relationship is a direct attribution of the relationship between the two presidents. The other thing that I want to mention is an example on the FTA. This isn't just about Detroit, and this is a great touch that the two presidents are going to go together to this auto factory there. But what it does, in my opinion, is provide another strategic leg to the partnership. We have, for a great many years, been a partnership, an alliance that has been defined by our security relationship. I would also suggest that the people-to-people relationship between the United States and Korea is extraordinary. But now what we have in the passage, hopefully, and ratification of this agreement will be a very firm economic basis. Now, we've always had the trade, we've always had that particular relationship, but now we have anchored in our relationship two elements, both security and economic, that will be fundamental as we go forward in the relationship. And I mentioned earlier that this trip was not orchestrated as a victory lap for the signing of the FTA. Up until just a few days ago, the scenario was that the Senate would not vote on this until around the 24th, or a week after or so that President Lee's visit was to occur. But what I think it is a tribute to how our administration, particularly in this case the Congress, takes a look at the value of the relationship and has adjusted the timetables so it will in fact be a celebration. It will get this FTA behind us, in which President Lee will not have loose ends to think about after he leaves the United States. So I think that is in fact a true testament to the quality of the relationship. Now, one of the other things that you normally look for on a summit state visit of this nature are, what are the deliverables? Now, we've got a few members of the State Department in the audience, and we can put them on the spot and ask them, you know, what are the deliverables? But quite frankly, I don't think there are any. Or there are relatively insignificant, because we're on a high note. This is a celebration. But if I were going to guess, and this is what you've asked us to do, of what this discussion of the summit is going to touch upon, first and foremost will be the FTA and what that means there. But more importantly, I think there will be, as Victor and Thomas pointed out, a further discussion about North Korea. And I can imagine there'll be some small amount of time set aside to talk about food aid, to talk about next steps with regard to six-party talks. I also think they're going to talk about China with regard to the North Korea policy and the concerns that the Chinese have about succession in North Korea. And of course, because of the things that we witnessed in 2010, there'll be a reaffirmation of the military component of this relationship, deterrence. Or what's going to happen if and when there is yet another provocation by the North Koreans? How will that work? I think there will be a reference, if there are public statements, to the upcoming negotiations on the nuclear agreement, referred to as a 123 agreement. Section 123 of U.S. law requires that the United States enter into nuclear cooperation agreements before we can actually do these things. That doesn't expire until 2014, but it's well underway now. So there'll be some mention of that in terms of there's no daylight between the parties involved. And I can imagine, because of the deterrent factor, there'll be perhaps a mention or briefly talking about the OPCON transfer that is scheduled now for the end of 2015. Now, besides that, there's something they ought to be talking about. So this is where you get my 2 cents worth, and you can pick it apart. I do believe that, as we've all talked about, the height of the relationship, how well it is doing, the best that we've ever seen before, there is a requirement, and I think these two leaders will begin this discussion. What are the bridging actions that they can begin to put in place to ensure that this level of cooperation, this feeling that we have of closeness in the relationship, continues beyond the elections of 2012? And I would just throw out a few things that they may think about. And this goes into, I don't have a clue, but this is maybe what they ought to be doing. One, from a collective point of view, how are they going to deal with North Korea in transition? What's the game? This is just a sequence. What's the game plan in terms of influencing Xi Jinping of China with regard to how the Chinese view North Korea? There needs to be an agreed upon appropriate and commensurate level of response to North Korea's negative behavior. That needs to transcend administrations. What you cannot do or should not do is to agree to something that is so extreme now that if there is a change of administrations in the United States, and there will be in Korea, that whatever's there will last the test of time, that it will not be reviewed. They need to begin this discussion about the implementation of the KORUS FTA in such a way that does not invite review. And I think, in my own opinion, they need to talk about incorporating the emerging influence of the Korean American community, the second generation of Korean American community in the United States. This is becoming more and more prominent, and I think it can add to the closeness of the relationship beyond 2012. So in sum, I think this is, as we started out, a celebration. There is not going to be the kind of deliverables that we've seen in the past that talks about those issues that we need to improve or to work upon, but it is one in which we all can be justly proud. I'm going to take my prerogative of stage ownership and perhaps go back to Victor and Tom on one of these issues, and that is on China. From your perspective, how important is this, and what have you seen recently that points to either concerns by Korea and the United States or areas in which we can cooperate for the future?
Well, it's a good question. I think that I agree with you that while I agree with you in the sense that a lot of what is said publicly in the summit, what is portrayed to the audience in the summit, is framed and managed very carefully. And I think that with this summit, as Jack said, it will be about celebrating the relationship and about how strong the relationship has become, the crowning achievement being the FTA. But behind closed doors, I think there will be very substantive discussions on things like North Korea and China. And with regard to China, I think I was actually just in Seoul on return this weekend, and there, I think on the Korean side, there is among policymakers a little bit of concern at how the general publics and the politics of China after Cheonan have started to fade a little bit into the background, in the sense that after the sinking of the Cheonan and Yongpyeon, all the polling in South Korea showed that both conservatives and progressives were really quite upset with China, and rightly so. And I think there's some concern that that is sort of fading out a little bit. Not completely erased, but it is certainly not at the same level of concern that policymakers have about what China's intentions are. And then I think at the same time in the United States, there is concern or a desire to really be able to sit down with allies and figure out how best to cooperate both with each other and with China to ensure China's peaceful rise within the current institutions of the international system that exists in Asia. So I think this is going to be a very important topic of discussion between the two leaders, both in terms of grand strategy, how they see their futures with China, also in terms of very operational things, and that is how the two countries should deal with China in a scenario of leadership transition that does not go well in North Korea. So I think but these are not the sort of issues that they're going to openly talk to you all in the press about, but I think it's clearly at the top of the agenda as the U.S. and ROK think about their sort of long-term strategy around the peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Tom, anything?
Well, I just to follow up on what Victor says, I'm sure there will be some direct and frank discussions in the meeting of how we together perceive China's role and work together to deal with the various challenges. But I think the fact of this meeting is really the message on this, that the U.S. and South Korea continue to have a very strong, mutually supportive, special relationship, that relationship is not just a military one, but extends very deeply into the economic and trade area, that we want to trade more with each other and are institutionalizing that. So I think, again, the fact that President Lee Myung-bak can come here to celebrate the approval on the U.S. side of the FTA is a very important signal to all of Asia, and including friends and allies and potential competitors like China, that we stand together.
Well, let me do this one more time in terms of my ability to ask the question. That way I don't have to answer it. But, you know, if I were sitting there, I might wonder, as an example, we've seen over the last few months some changes, some subtle in South Korea in terms of their relationship with North Korea. There's a new unification minister who has talked openly about finding some degree of flexibility in dealing with North Korea. There have now been 2 meetings between the North and South with regard to 6-party talks. And so somebody might wonder if President Lee was going to present to President Obama any suggestion that there's a potential shift in how to deal with North Korea. There is the expectation that following these 2 meetings, one in Bali, one in Beijing, between North and South, that later this month there will be a similar meeting by the U.S. Senior Representative and his North Korean counterparts. Now, I, for one, I'll jump in and say,
yeah,
I answer my own question.
Yeah.
I'll give you a chance to. I don't think there is. I think President Lee personally has a consistency about him that any changes that we see will be extraordinarily subtle, but retain the principled approach that the South Koreans have taken over the last 3 years. And that really has been a hallmark. Whether you like anybody's policy or not, you've got to step back and really admire the consistency, the consultation, and the fact that we now essentially have Seoul in the lead with regard to a relationship between the North and South. So any changes that come out of this, one, probably will not be trumpeted by President Lee on this visit, and 2, they'll be so subtle that there will remain, as I say, a consistency in the principle involved. But I wonder, Victor, you've been there recently. Any sense from your part of change in the air?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first, overall, I would agree with the answer that Jack gave to his question. I think he was right on the mark. How often can you say that in a session like this? But I think he is right on the mark. I mean, I think, you know, there's been a lot of press speculation with the shifting out of the unification minister and criticism of Lee for his policies that there may be a change. But I'm of the same view that he really has held a very principled approach on how he wanted to deal with North Korea, you know, which was essentially he's willing to do a lot if there's a reciprocal action on the part of the North, and if there isn't, then he's just not going to waste his time. And I think he's pretty much held strongly to that, and I think he will continue to do so. This does not rule out humanitarian assistance, which he has been willing to do, but I think it does rule out other larger forms of cooperation until there is either movement on South Korean human rights issues or on denuclearization. I do agree with Jack that I think coming out of this consultation between the 2 leaders, it's highly likely that there will be a second U.S. DPRK high-level meeting. I believe that it'll be very hard for the administration to call these exploratory talks, as they called the last one in August, because if you get back again for a second round, you're pretty much getting back to a negotiation. And then the burden of proof will be on both the United States and South Korea to explain to all of us why they have any confidence that this negotiation is going to result in a good agreement when past agreements have all fallen by the wayside, and when the DPRK really has done nothing, publicly at least, to give the Obama administration any confidence that a negotiation will result in a better outcome than the past 2 negotiations. So I think there are real challenges. At the same time, I think for both the Lee and Obama administrations, they both understand that if you leave North Korea alone for too long, they're going to do something bad. Another provocation, perhaps a 3rd nuclear test. And I think everybody, not to mention a nuclear program that has really developed unabated for the past 3 to 5 years and a missile program that has really been unchecked for the past decade. So I think there is a reason to go back in the sense that you want to try to contain some of these problems, even if you're not entirely confident that it will lead to irreversible denuclearization.
Let me just add just quickly. I think follow on what Victor said. It seems to me that that both the U.S. and South Korea would like to find a way to get back to dialogue with North Korea in a manner which has some promise of achieving our objectives, but that, as Victor has said, is not in anybody's interest to avoid talking in these circumstances. I don't expect surprises in this visit, and I say that having closely experienced two summit meetings between U.S. and Korean leaders that did bring great surprises. The first being, people, this has faded so far back in time, people have nearly forgotten, but when President Clinton hosted President Kim Young-sam to a state visit back in 1990, or I think it was a state visit in 1993, we did encounter some surprises, and it took us quite a long time to get over that. We again encountered some surprises and some mutual misunderstandings when President Kim Dae-jung came to Washington to meet with President Bush at the beginning of the administration. I think we've learned our lessons from that history, and that both sides are preparing this very, very carefully. If and when we reopen in some way with North Korea, I think we're going to do it together, and I don't think you're going to see any differences in this meeting.
Yeah. Let me add, if I can, to Tom's point. I think it's a good one that goes back to the point of the relationship between the two leaders and the nations as a whole. You know, I had distant memories or watching Tom in earlier iterations, and then seeing on the sideline how the Bush-Nomohyun era went. But I can give you as an example, when you're in a working situation at the White House and you're preparing for this, there can be no closer consultation. I can recall from the 1998 Kim Dae-jung summit. And without putting names associated with this, I can tell you that while I was in Victor's position as Director for Asian Affairs back then, I got summoned to New York as the traveling party. President Kim Dae-jung first came to New York. There was a dinner there, then they were going to come for the state visit here. And the purpose of me going up there was so that a senior person in the Kim Dae-jung administration could say, here, Mr. Pritchard, here are the talking points that President Kim Dae-jung is going to be using in the summit meeting. Let's make sure there are no surprises among us. Now, that's remarkable, the level of confidence and the desirability to make sure that there were no surprises there. So we've had both ways, and my sense is that what we're about to see will resemble very closely what I experienced in the Kim Dae-jung visit there. Let me ask, are there any other points before we open it up to a discussion that you'd like to revisit?
No.
Okay, good. Well, here's the part where we get to pick and choose among the questions. So if there are those of you out in the audience that I particularly don't like, and your hand is going to get tired. I'm not. Yeah.
Chris's hand is always up first, Jack.
I know it's always up first, but he isn't. Wait, he is not Helen Thomas. So in this case, Bob Hathaway gets the first question, and then Chris, you get second.
Jack, if this means I no longer get Chris's newsletter, I'd like to cede first to him. Let's fast forward 5 years. It's 2016. We're back in this room. We're looking at the FTA. What are the benchmarks for success? What do we think needs to happen in order for us 5 years from now to say this was really all we hoped it would be? For instance, USTR talks about $10 to $12 billion a year in additional U.S. exports. Is that realistic? What are your other benchmarks? And the other side of the question is, what are the obstacles? What do you most worry about that may intrude so this doesn't prove to be the success we hope it is?
Do you want to tackle that first, Tom?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the estimates are genuinely valid estimates, that we do expect that this will lead to a substantial increase in exports of U.S. products. That estimate, relates principally to goods rather than services, and I think we expect to gain a lot, almost equally as much from the export of services as we do from the export of products. I think from the Korean side, the ambition has always been to use the FTA to strengthen and modernize the Korean economy by opening up the services sector, allowing, making it, creating a situation in which Koreans have to meet the competition from abroad and can learn from it. And so, I guess if I think about the future of this agreement, I see it almost more in services than in goods. And I think if it's to be perceived as a failure on the U.S. side, I think it will be because of the regulations are not alleviated. The market is not really opened. American service providers as well as exporters are not able to operate in the Korean market as much as they anticipate. I think the Korean intention is quite clear, but you face all sorts of challenges in actually dealing in that market. We talked a lot about automobiles. I think the way the global auto market is turning, we're going to forget about sort of national origins in terms of automobiles and trucks and be in a global market anyway. And I have a great deal of confidence that the agreement will achieve its economic objectives, and I'm even more confident that it will create a better basis for the entire relationship that will enable us to achieve the other things we want to achieve together. One issue that will come up is whether Korea will participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Will KORUS become a springboard for that broader Asia-Pacific free trade area or economic cooperation area that we all look for, and I think it's going to be very important that Korea participate in that.
Yeah, I want to pick up where Tom left off, which is that 5-6 years from now, I think one of the true metrics for how successful KORUS will be remembered will be what it does for regional trade, because KORUS really, if it gets passed and all goes well, will really be a springboard for TPP. TPP has sort of been sitting idle because KORUS has not moved forward, and many Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese that I talk to are always debating, +3 FTA versus TPP. I think part of that discussion was in part because Korea was really not taking a position on TPP because KORUS had not been passed yet. Once KORUS gets passed, I think they'll come out pretty strongly in favor of TPP, and I think, quite frankly, I think Japan will too. There'll be a lot of pressure on Japan to come on board with this under the new government in Tokyo. So if it does act as a springboard and the Obama administration can get a framework for TPP in place by APEC, that would be a very important accomplishment. And then, 5 years from now, if that continues and you move to a free trade area, the Asia Pacific, I think that would ultimately be in addition to all the bilateral things that Tom talked about, that would be a very important metric of how important KORUS is, because everybody understands it is a milestone free trade agreement, not just for the U.S. and Korea, but in the broader scheme of trade agreements. It's a prototypical agreement.
Jack, could I borrow your chair and ask
Absolutely.
Victor a question? You've just been in Korea at the end of last week when it became apparent that KORUS was going to pass the U.S. Congress. What what did you come away with in terms of the prospects for Korean passage of the?
Well, you know, it's now, you know, ironically now they're on a slower track than Congress appears to be. But at the same time, I think the Lee administration has tried to manage this in as very careful a way as they can. They clearly have the majority to move it through, but I think, you know, they want to avoid a situation where people are throwing shoes and blocking the doorways and things. As all of you know, I mean, this is the history of this agreement is such that everybody who was once in support of it was against it before they were for it, and everybody who was against it then became for it before they went against it again. So, and I think for many on the South Korean side in terms of political opposition, you know, they're the party politics which require them to oppose it, but at the same time for many of these key National Assembly people, this agreement is good for them. It helps them in their own districts and well. So I think, I mean, frankly, I thought the real obstacles were on the U.S. side, and we seem to be at almost at the finish line. And I think if and when that happens, that will put a lot more pressure on the South Korean side to pull through, which I think they will. I think they will do. So.
Good, Helen.
I'm going to figure out a way to make you pay for that. I did sort out with a wire service, so we have that similarity. And I may be getting to be the same size too, Hal. Thanks for the TPP. That was my third of the enormously clever set of questions I had worked up, so saved you on that. When you look at the centrality of China, for better and for worse, when we're talking about the six-party talks, and you look at this fact that China is also undergoing a transition, they will definitely have new leaders. Do you find yourself thinking that we are inevitably stuck in a limbo for this year and maybe even next year? Because that gets us back to Victor's point, and we've all sort of said it over the years. You know, if you don't engage with North Korea in some way, they're going to do something to get your attention, and we probably won't like it. What can we do or say this year that, if anything, that would be beyond merely a holding pattern in hopes that something bad doesn't happen?
Yeah, let me jump in, since Victor and Tom have gotten first questions or so. You know, my own opinion, and it's, I think, echoed throughout the Washington and wider community, is that even if we get back to the formality of six-party talks, for which obviously the Chinese would like to see happen, they certainly believe that a North Korea engaged in negotiations is a North Korea that is less likely, less prone to military provocation. But I don't know anyone who believes that the talks will succeed. And so your basic premise of being in limbo, if I can expand on that to suggest that it means that we may very well have some talks for talk's sake, but actual progress is not likely to occur. Now, does that mitigate against letting the North Koreans off on their own, and if you don't pay enough attention to them, something bad's going to happen? It may. In that regard, the Chinese will have played some role in that. But the transitions that are occurring throughout the world, and particularly in Asia, are going to be such that the North Koreans cannot afford to compromise. The Chinese cannot afford to put the kind of pressure on a transitional North Korean leadership that we would need to see actual success. And quite frankly, I don't anticipate significant changes in the U.S. and South Korea coherent approach to North Korea. So the best that I would see is crossing of fingers, hoping that some element of discussion precludes wandering about by North Korea in dangerous territory.
Yep.
Crossing of fingers, Doctor.
I mean, the thing I would add is that, for lack of a better diplomatic term, what the diplomacy does is it parks the issue, right? It parks the issue so that you don't have another crisis. And the negotiators will say, of course, no, this is still about denuclearization. Of course they'll say that, but I think the reality is it parks it so that no one has to deal with a crisis in the near term. But I still think even if you get back to the talks for talk's sake, there are things that you can do to try to move the ball forward. And this was the stuff that I wrote about in the Post yesterday about trying to engage the North Koreans on other issues related to their nuclear capabilities that would be important prerequisites for denuclearization anyway. You know, whether it's safety or getting them to stop, getting them to stop thinking about light water reactors, because again, after Fukushima, I don't think anybody wants North Korea to have a light water reactor, including the Chinese, I would add. I don't think they want to see North Korea have a light water reactor after Fukushima. So I think even if you get back to talks for talk's sake and they get criticized from the outside for it, I think on the inside there's still things that they can work on to try to move the ball forward even if they're small steps, still move the ball forward.
Mm-hmm. Tom? No? Okay. Mike?
Thanks. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. He's arriving here in the midst of perhaps the greatest financial and economic breakdown crisis in modern, or maybe all history, as Mervyn King said yesterday. And there's great concern across Asia over the West's hyperinflationary potential of their massive bailouts, money printing, debasing the dollar, and so on. Don't you think that this will be brought up, or if it's not, how do you think Lee Myung-bak, well, how he would bring it up or what he's thinking? And secondly, I think what's left out of the sort of scenario that Jack first laid out and you all spoke to on North Korea is the dramatic change over these last few months in the role of Russia and with China in the whole Far East, especially since Putin has returned and Medvedev dumped Kudrin. I think you have to see that they're very, very serious about this great development of the Far East, and they see the Korea issue as absolutely fundamental part of whether they can in fact launch these great development projects across the Far East. And their view, as you know, is a peace through development approach to pose that they build the pipeline, possibly rail, the Razon project and other things. And I'd ask you to address that. It's my sense that the State Department, at least, Hillary and Campbell, have been very supportive of letting South Korea lead, but encouraging them to re-engage, the re-engagement you mentioned. And that this has to be seen in the context of a continuing kind of reset approach with the Russians as a great power agreement with Russia and China and the United States, working on this issue in the midst of the greatest global financial crisis in history. So it's a big issue, but I think this visit and this Korea question is central to it.
Yeah. Mike, let me start and then ask Tom and Victor to join in. Having watched the Russian participation in the denuclearization effort through the six-party talks that go back 8 years now, I'm not ready to assign to them a critical place in the resolution of this and other issues in the Far East. They are clearly driven by their own economic development requirements in the Far East. There is, I think, a great deal of promise and a great deal of concern about a potential gas pipeline that will have to be worked out. It hasn't yet worked out in terms of guarantees, et cetera. So I'm not so convinced that this is such a critical issue with regard to Russia. The other aspects that you mentioned are certainly worth taking a shot at.
Well, just to fill in a blank, obviously in talking about the agenda for this meeting, I think we have to, we're certainly the global financial crisis, the whole broad issue is going to figure, I think, and very highly in the agenda. I think in the early part of our economic crisis, beginning back in 2008, Lee Myung-bak was very supportive of working with the United States to address the global crisis. I think he will be equally so in this visit, and quite certainly that'll be a big subject for discussion. I agree with what Jack said on the Russia angle. It can't be ignored, but I don't think it's a centerpiece of the six-party process at this point. Victor?
On the global financial crisis, I mean, I think the way, and we're all guessing, but we've all been a part of past summits. I think the way it's likely to play out is that they'll have a broad discussion on it, and President Lee will want to know what President Obama's overall strategy or plan is with regard to this, and then he'll want to know how he can help. I think that's most likely to be what you see there. I think something else I'll talk about, which will not be as comfortable a topic, will be, and if I were, if we were on the NSC staff in Seoul, I'd be writing this into the talking points, would be to ask President Obama, come November and with the super committee, I mean, how do you see, how is this going to affect U.S. capacity to operate in Asia? What should we expect? Countries in Asia are asking this question today, in conferences and in think tanks and everything. So, I imagine that they're going to have some discussion about that as well. And then on Russia, I did sort of a small study on sort of Russia's role in the six-party talks. And the interesting thing about Russia's role is they always tend to be the most active when there is absolutely nothing else going on in the six-party talks. When there is nothing else going on, that's when the Russians start to become more active, and they have an idea. Gas pipeline, light water reactors, whatever the idea is. And if that is at all useful in getting talks started, then they quickly become marginalized, because if that creates impetus for the U.S. and DPRK to re-engage, that's who the DPRK wants to talk to in the first place, so Russia all of a sudden gets marginalized. And I think we're right now in one of these situations where you hear a lot more about the gas pipeline and other ideas because there's really nothing else going on. But if the U.S. and ROK re-engage with the DPRK in a multilateral or a six-party format, Russia will again be, this is the dilemma of their participation in six-party talks. They are most active and most helpful when there's absolutely nothing going on. And when it is successful, it means they get marginalized again. So it's not a very good role to be in, but they're good sports about it. So,
John. Then we'll come over to this. Wait for the microphone. Thanks.
To follow on the last question and your op-ed piece, which I enjoyed in the Washington Post, and even though I live well outside the Beltway, I still occasionally read the Washington Post. You repeatedly used the word engagement in your op-ed piece, number one, and not meaning to ignore Ambassadors Hubbard or Pritchard. I'm just, and you also said that accurately that the North Koreans wouldn't even know how to spell nuclear safety if they were writing it in English. But you also said that it was in everyone's interest to identify and negotiate some sort of alternative energy quid pro quo. And given where Russia is going right now with their assertions of wanting to develop their own economy and their own economic interests in putting a pipeline in, and given Lee Myung-bak, maybe nobody else was surprised by Lee Myung-bak coming out and being very public about saying that he was actively involved and interested with or through the Russians in this pipeline idea, but I was certainly surprised. What are your thoughts on, given that the U.S. probably is the most interesting entity with whom the North could engage, what are your thoughts about how Obama and Lee together or independently or whatever, what could they propose, or what would you propose as an engagement that would be of interest to the North?
Well, I mean, I think first on the pipeline idea, maybe it didn't surprise me as much that Lee didn't support it but didn't speak negatively of it. I mean, I think that's in part because he gained nothing by speaking negatively on it. And also, I think in part because he likes big projects, right? When he was mayor of Seoul, he liked big projects. The canal project was a big project. So he likes these big transformative projects. Practically speaking, I don't think any South Korean government would invest in such a project as an actual source of energy for South Korea, just because they don't trust the North Koreans. If the pipe was coming through North Korea, they would invest in it to the extent that it would be an economic development project, a way of assisting the North, in exchange for denuclearization. So in that sense, I think if that is something that the North Koreans become excited about and would be willing to trade pieces of their nuclear program for, if whatever works. I mean, if that works, that's useful. I think the most practical way of doing this is, of course, conventional electricity, which is what the South Koreans offered initially offered in the 2005 six-party agreement, what the No-Myun government offered, and that is actually the most practical and the quickest way to get electricity power into North Korea, given their current energy infrastructure grid. So now, of course, the comeback would be, well, they didn't like it the last time. Why would they like it this time? I think the main difference being that if you can get China, I think it's easy to get the United States, but if you can get China to agree that light water reactors post-Fukushima should not be in North Korea, then I think you have a better shot at moving other sorts of energy ideas in front of the North Koreans. I mean, Jack and Tom will know this well, but when we used to have these discussions with the North Koreans, we threw everything, wind power, we threw everything at them as an alternative to light water reactors. But no one had ever anticipated Fukushima at that time. And I think so, and after Fukushima, most importantly, I don't think the Chinese want to see any sort of nuclear power in North Korea that could be mismanaged or somehow could, even through, not through simply mismanagement, but an act of God could actually become a major liability for the entire, in all of mainland Asia. So my point, I guess, is that the context of a discussion with the DPRK on alternative energy sources, including conventional electricity, may be easier to do today than it was pre-Fukushima.
Let me just add a little fillip, because I think the issue kind of came up tangentially in the early 1990s when we put together the agreed framework, which was resting on the idea that safe South Korean nuclear light water reactors would be put in North Korea. Mm-hmm. The original idea was that, we just sort of provide Russian or Soviet, and I guess it was Russian by then, Russian reactors to North Korea, and that was anathema to the Japanese, who in the final analysis have to be counted on for economic development in North Korea as you go forward. And if it was anathema pre-Fukushima, it's even more so now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let me just say that I think it's extraordinarily important to try to figure out what the North Koreans' view of what occurred in Fukushima is, because if that's not a factor for them, then my concern is they're going to fall back to what they've wanted all along, the light water reactors, for political reasons, not so much energy, and it does that, but it is so ingrained in their vocabulary that unless there has been something that has shaken that off, and Fukushima may very well be, but I don't think we're in a position yet to know how the North Koreans, in their own honest assessment, have taken a look at this. So it's going to be very important. Very good question. Scott?
My question is about the U.S.-South Korean nuclear relationship. Jack mentioned the 123 agreement and the possibility that this might come up. And that's actually the issue that I think has the most potential for getting off on the wrong track. What do the two presidents need to say in order to frame this issue in positive terms so that that won't happen, especially in light of the fact that Congress seems to be wanting to raise the bar in terms of expectations for 123 agreements?
Yeah, I would be speculating, but my own sense is that both parties want to renew the agreement, and so the objective is the same. And what you haven't said, but is on the table, is a South Korean desire for pyroprocessing as part of a solution to spent fuel storage, for which the United States for technical reasons, it finds it not yet to be a proven technology, not conducive to put into this particular agreement. But I would suggest from a creative point of view that the two are going to find a way to reinforce publicly their desires to move quickly to this, and setting aside some of those technical questions. And you could speculate whether it be a side letter or something else in which the U.S. would acknowledge the concerns and the desires of the Koreans.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the purposes of the for the summit and the public presentation, the whole joint study on pyroprocessing, one of the reasons they agreed to do it was because it was a great way to sort of say, well, you know, we're doing the study together. I mean, it was a great way for them to deflect all these questions. But there are hard questions here that both sides need to answer. And you know, if there was any expectation that they could do that with the summit as an action-forcing event, I've seen. I mean, maybe I just haven't, but I have seen no indication that they're ready to make any sort of announcement on this. And we'll probably stick to the basic talking point of how, well, you know, we're doing this joint study and we'll see how it goes. But you know, I think with something like this, I think as Jack said, in the end, we are really pretty much on the same page, and you know, both sides have to compromise a little bit. You know, the South Koreans, I think, are overreaching to some extent, and the U.S. is holding back to some extent. So they've got to find the middle ground. I don't think it'll be in this summit meeting, and to the extent possible, I think both sides want to keep this at an experts level rather than allowing it to rise to the level of a summit where it can become quickly politicized, and I think that's what everybody's trying to avoid.
Ernest? The microphone is finding its way to you.
Thank you. Ernie Preed, Manufacturers Alliance. Of course, you each started by saying something like it's the relationship best it's ever been, it's the highest point, best we've ever seen. But this is the political security relationship. But on the economic side, at least my observation in recent years, is that we've been in relative decline compared with other trading partners, the Europeans with their FTA, be it with certainly with China, which trade is growing twice as fast as ours, much larger, investment even. The KORUS will give it a boost back for the U.S., but I would still think it's a long uphill struggle to even regain the market share we may have had a couple of years ago. So my question is really, how fundamental is this change where we're no longer the leading trading investment partner, we're maybe third or fourth, relative terms going down, maybe at a slower pace now. How does that change the relationship, including a big defense commitment? And even more specifically, what's going on between South Korea and China these days about commercial relations, trade investment, and in practical terms? Are they moving toward some kind of investment agreement, toward even an FTA or something that might build in the same direction that KORUS is high visibility with the U.S. at this stage?
Thank you.
Well, I mean, just to put it, I put the phrase, Ernie, in sort of relationship terms rather than, you know, the U.S. economic standing in the relationship. I think we've seen the same kind of decline in manufacturing exports to Korea that we've seen around the world. It's been part of a trend. And one of the purposes of this FTA is to, at least to a small degree, begin to try to, is to begin to try to turn that around and increase U.S. exports. I think the FTA, and I think you would agree, in relationship terms, is going to be a plus in the sense that we now have a framework for dealing with these trade issues, trade investment issues that come up. Whereas 20 years ago we were yelling at each other, we had a very difficult business relationship, et cetera. I think this brings in a lot of things that will make it better, but it's not going to, obviously not going to solve this long-term decline that we're seeing around the world.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think, and I agree with your diagnosis of the situation, that this will not necessarily lead to a regaining of market share like the United States used to have with Korea. But I think there are 2 points, and admittedly this is the view of a political scientist more than it is an economist, so you'll have to excuse me. But the first, I think, is that it sends a very important message to the region about where the United States is on trade. And that was a very big question for many in Asia for, really the first 2.5 years of the Obama administration. And again, if this leads then to TPP and then potentially FTAP, while the U.S. may not have the same share that it had in the past, it does show that, one of the 2 pillars on which the United States has rested leadership in Asia, free trade, is still intact in addition to the military relationship. And I think that's important. For Koreans, I think they understand very clearly that China is their most important economic partner for the future. But Koreans, I think, have also learned to walk and chew gum at the same time, which is that they understand that they have a very strong economic relationship for the next 20 years, 25 years with China, but they also understand that their most important strategic partner and their political partner is and will remain the United States. Now, there is, to the extent that this can sort of bleed, the economic influence of China can bleed into the political relationship, I think this is something that the Koreans will work very hard to balance and manage. Because in the end, I think they are tied to us, the United States, for a whole variety of other reasons having to do with the common political agenda, common political values that ties them in a way that China is not tied. The Koreans do not see themselves tied to China in the same way. And so KORUS is important in that sense, because if there were no KORUS, it would really look like the United States has basically given up, right, and given it all to China. And then it would bleed into the political and strategic relationship.
Chad?
Hello. I'm Chad from KEI, and as part of a new feature, we're taking questions from our Twitter followers. So I have a question here. If anyone would like to ask a question in future and you can't attend an event, just message us on Twitter. So Roger Lau would like to know, I know that Pyongyang will follow the state visit closely. What do you think North Korea is thinking? Thank you. And that's to anyone, I guess.
Jack, you've been there most recently, haven't you?
Yeah.
Well, recently as in 11 months ago. It's now.
Victor, you've been there since then.
Yeah. There are a couple things are going on. One, I think you know and appreciate the North Koreans follow this extraordinarily closely. They will look at every statement by every public official, both U.S. and South Korean, to try to parse what it means for them. On the bright side, they're going to be looking for where are the differences? Where can we exploit anything that appears to be different in their understanding of the U.S. ROK approach to North Korea? What's going to be interesting for me is there is going to be the following week a meeting in the United States, a track 2 kind of academic meeting in which there's a delegation of about 7 North Koreans, and I'm going to participate in that. And I'll be very anxious, as our Twitter question suggested, what are they thinking? What's their reaction on that? I don't expect much public reaction unless there is some type of condemnation of the regime, and I don't expect that out of this summit meeting.
I would agree. I think they're going to analyze everything very closely, and they're not going to report any of it, right, to their public. I mean, none of that will get seen by the public, and they will feign a great deal of disinterest, but I think they will watch it very intently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it. Okay, Karin?
Thank you, Jack. Both Jack and Victor mentioned the possibility of food aid decision coming out of that summit. I hope that means that you know something that I don't know. What do you think about POW MIA remains recovery, whether or not that's going to be a topic of discussion? Everyone started out their presentation about remarking on the exceptional closeness of the ROK-U.S. relationship and the coordination on DPRK policy, but obviously one member of Congress doesn't think so. There's been a hold on Sung Kim. I don't know whether or not that hold remains, but that to me leads to two other questions. What do you think Lee Myung-bak expects to get out of his address to Congress? And the fact that we don't have an ambassador there right now, I think is a problem. What do you think, what role do you think U.S. ROK relations will play in the next South Korean election? And what do you think Lee Myung-bak needs to bring back in order to make sure it plays well for him? And a follow-up on that question would be, well, okay, it's that I just heard, and I haven't had a chance to check the newspaper report, so I don't know the accuracy about this. It happened last month, if it did happen, the rapes of 2 teenage girls in South Korea by USFK forces. I mean, is there a potential for the kind of demonstrations we haven't seen in a while?
Karen, thank you for those 7 questions.
let me pick a couple of Karen.
Let me just say this is one that's very important. Tom has had some firsthand experience in a couple of these. So, Tom, please.
Well, first, in the realm of experience, I've been an ambassador. I've also been a chargé d'affaires or acting ambassador for long stretches in several countries, and you know, I always knew the difference between being ambassador and being chargé. As chargé, you have the same responsibilities but less influence, and therefore I would hope Congress would recognize this and approve Sung Kim's nomination as quickly as possible. It is not good for our nation to leave an ambassadorial post vacant for a lengthy period of time in an important country. And one of the important things, of course, that happens in Korea as well as elsewhere is tragic accidents or unacceptable behavior, and I've gone through that too. I believe that you know, I've been following these incidents only from afar by reading the press, but it strikes me that you know, everybody on the U.S. side has done what they can do to recognize the feelings of the Korean people in apologizing and expressing regrets and doing everything possible to handle these cases with dispatch and human understanding. Kurt Campbell made a very strong statement. I've seen statements from others. I've seen the command people have come out. So, you know, sometimes we learn our lessons, and this is you know, these events are always terrible and tragic, but I do believe we're handling them well, and I also think that I will venture to say that I think the SOFA is working. I read today that at least one of the accused rapists has been turned over to Korean authorities, that the process is underway for others, and that's what it's meant to do. And I think we ought to, while lamenting these terrible things, I think we ought to recognize that everybody's trying their best to prevent this from becoming a big issue.
Yeah. On this issue, I was in Seoul last week, and remember opening the newspaper, and the first thing I saw was this rape case, and I thought, gosh, you know, the week before the state visit, you know, how is this all going to unfold? I was there for a set of meetings, including with President Lee, and participated in some things with Kurt Campbell and Steinberg and Bader, and I mean, Kurt was the only official there, and as Tom said, he handled it very well, very open, very public statement of apology. The commanders came out. There's a curfew on all U.S. soldiers now in Korea for the next 3 months. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Now, of course, how these cases end up. It's always how they end up that really causes the uproar. So right now, at least for the moment, it looks as though this has been, people have worked very hard, not just to manage the situation, but to address the problem as best they could. On food aid and POW MIA remains, I don't think that the summit will be the place in which they'll make any sort of public statements about either of these things, because, quite frankly, I think it gives it way too high a profile than either side would want it to have. I think they are trying to re-engage on POW MIA remains, which I believe is just pushing on an open door in North Korea, because the North has wanted to do this for some time. And the food situation, as you know well, Karin, I think many on the NGO side are becoming very impatient with the Obama administration's delay on making a decision on food. And I think, I mean, without, I'm not trying to be nasty about it or anything, but I think part of the reason there is a delay is because, I think there is a desire to see some signs of cooperation from the North, both in terms of monitoring issues with regard to food, but also the broader scheme of things, whether the North is really ready to re-engage on some of these other issues as well. That is not using food as a political weapon. It is being realistic about how you have to deal with North Korea. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen more of a delay than many in the NGO community would like to see.
Karin, I know we've got several unanswered portions to your questions, but you're a familiar face, and we'll talk to you. We have time for one more last question I'm going to ask Larry. This microphone's coming there, right to your left.
Larry Nix from CRS. I want to go back to Victor's comment about Asian concerns about the U.S. budgetary situation, which are quite real. And in the case of Korea, you have, coming out of the Futenma issue in Japan, you have the statements by Senator Levin, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, that Chris Nelson has reported, questioning whether the big plans to move the 2nd Division back to Pyeongtaek and move thousands of American family members out there are really going to be budgetarily sustainable in view of the likelihood of major defense budget cuts coming out of this group of 12 in Congress. And I'm wondering that, given the likelihood of major defense cuts coming out of whatever results the Committee of 12 produce, is there a danger that next year we're going to see the Lee administration in its last year pressing very hard for U.S. commitments to, number one, proceed with the move to Pyeongtaek, and perhaps more fundamentally, number two, to guarantee that there will be no changes in U.S. troop strength in Korea when, because of these defense cuts that are coming, the Pentagon won't be prepared to make those kinds of commitments next year until it really sorts out what these big defense cuts are going to mean for the entire U.S. global posture in terms of our overall military presence overseas. Is this going to be a real potential issue of contention between the U.S. and South Korea next year?
Yeah. Larry, I think it's an excellent question, but I also think we're not yet in a position to answer that. There are a couple things that I'd like to address, one of which you talked about, and that is increasing family tours in South Korea. This is an issue that U.S. commanders have wanted for a number of reasons, but primarily I think it enhances readiness. You know, when you are not having to retrain every 12 months, however staggered it is, a new set of U.S. experts, U.S. fighters that are there, and you have a degree of stability for a portion, and to some extent it's a large portion of the U.S. military population. They're stabilized for 3-year tours with their family. It represents a lot of other things in terms of U.S. commitment. This is an issue that I think is going to be one of the first ones that will have some type of a fallout, if you will, from potential budgetary cuts there. I can't see the Lee administration for the remainder of this year up until the election next year trying to extract commitments or concessions based upon what may happen and what the consequences of that. You know, and I'll ask Tom and Victor about that. But I think it's one of those areas when you take a look at the efficiency of the U.S. operation in Asia, in Korea. It's one that benefits the United States as equally as well as it benefits Korea to have our force presence there. And so, I don't know, you want to add to?
Well, I mean, I guess, Larry, I think most of these changes that we have been making have been largely driven by the United States and by our policy rather than by the Korean side. I don't think any of us know where it's going, how it will all come out. You know, these issues have a way of causing friction, but we've gotten better, I think, at talking about them, at planning these things, about understanding each other's processes. So I don't see this emerging as a huge issue in the next year anyway.
Okay. Anything? Well, then let me, on behalf of all of us, but primarily I'd like to thank Victor for coming up with the idea and express the appreciation for Ambassador Hubbard and the Korea Society for being here, but mostly for you for some excellent questions, some of which are left unanswered or sidestepped is another word for that. This is a terrific week in which the U.S. Korea relationship is going to be showcased for what it is. President Lee will, as Victor has pointed out at the beginning, we've got an arrival ceremony, you've got a Chamber of Commerce lunch, you've got a summit meeting, a vice presidential lunch, a state dinner, a joint session of Congress, a trip to Detroit. You know, what more can you do to celebrate the relationship? So with that, thank you all for joining us. And thanks to our Twitter question. That's a first.